Warning: the Curious Native podcast contains mature topics and themes that are intended for an older youth and adult audience. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey, welcome to the Curious Native Podcast. I'm your host, Una Smuck at the end, and in today's episode, we'll be having a conversation with a guest. For the first time ever, we have a guest on the Curious Native Podcast, EaglesElatis, and we'll be having a general conversation about white veganism and the effects it has on Black and Indigenous communities. Fair warning, it does break out a few different times, mostly in the beginning when we are like first started introducing ourselves to each other in like the beginning. But beyond that, it should be it's all good. It's understandable, and you can hear our conversation just fine. So, but I did want to just warn you that it does break out for a couple seconds in the beginning, but it does quickly clear up. So, with that being said, please keep going. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I had to step outside because it seems the Wi-Fi inside's not working. So you might hear, a little bit of wind and birds chirping, but we should be good now.
A little indigenous ambiance.
Yes. Well, I was saying, I messaged you a long time ago to see if we got on the podcast. It didn't quite work out then, but then I made a Twitter post asking any of my fellow Indigenous people if they would like to, be on a podcast episode talking about the effects of white veganism and the way it affects Indigenous communities, around the world. And you originally commented on there first, I think right after Ben Tal, and you said you would like, to be on the episode. So I reached out to you.
I think I really was more encouraging the episode to happen because I wanted to listen to it, but I'm happy to be on it. Because I don't think there's enough discourse about how certain sectors of veganism harmfully impact communities of color, and for us especially what we deal with as Indigenous people. So
Yes. I 100% agree. And especially with, about the point about discourse, there's not enough discourse about this issue and this phenomenon that affects Indigenous people. I was just, scrolling through YouTube this morning and just kind of looking through to see, what were other people saying about white veganism just on the platform. And a lot of the people who were talking about white veganism seem to be colonizers and settlers and, other, I'm gonna say tokens, people who like I've seen this post on YouTube that was talking about, white veganism not being real, and it was from the point of they put in quotations POC. So, to me that's just it's quite telling about, the attitude towards white veganism outside of Indigenous and Black circles, especially in the online sphere.
yeah, and it's just like there's so much delusional denialism in that, because this is proven. I mean, there are literally decades of scholarly research articles about white nationalism in veganism. Like it's people who are like, oh, I've never seen it. It doesn't exist. It's not real. Like the New York Times wrote about it. Like this isn't
I
something that Indigenous people are and Black people are making up. This is something that's documented in the academic realm. It's written about in journalism, and if you haven't seen it, it's because you didn't want to, not because it's not there.
or you haven't, experienced it. It's like a lot of people, I've seen that too, of people denying it. And it's like papers, and, especially the New York Times writing about it, that didn't happen. It's still happening. I've experienced it. My experience it, especially a year ago when those pictures of the baby seal being clubbed was circulating again, like it does every couple of years online. It,
Yeah.
it gathered, white vegans from all over, just that whole community, even ones that were, saying they're a bit more progressive and, they support Indigenous people. It's like they jumped on that bandwagon and ran with it. And that's
Oh
like,
yeah.
one of the hey, Inuit people are, you know, they're living out in the cold. It's Arctic, you know, they gotta do what they gotta do to survive. And I'm gonna just say it, if they gotta club a baby seal, then they gotta club a baby seal. That's survival. And indigenous people have been doing this sustainably for, you know, thousands of years, as long as we've been on this continent. I just
It's frustrating. It's
it is
really
very
frustrating.
it is very frustrating. And you know, with that comes, you know, it, it's so hard to articulate, you know,
Oh, I
especially,
get it.
which, you know, I do think I was seeing when I was scrolling on YouTube. That was one of the points that, you know, people were having against the idea that white veganism is a thing, is if we can't explain it and articulate it, then it doesn't exist. And it's like, no, it just means that, you know, we don't quite have all, you know, we don't quite have all the pieces together to describe what is happening to us yet, you know?
Right, right. Well, I think that that's
That has
when
something more to do with maybe education. And, you know,
oh yeah. But that
I,
denialism is a product of colonialism, that if you everything is a court of law and you have to be able to prove everything beyond any shadow of doubt or it's not real. And it just ignores the certain fundamental human principles, like the fact that trust isn't a court of law. Like your trust instinct is hardwired. This is a deep brain survival instinct.
it's
So when people lose
instinct.
your trust, you don't have to have it proven to you that they don't deserve your trust. You don't have any control over your trust. You just stop trusting them. And that's what you see in indigenous communities and Black communities when it comes to mainstream vegans, is a lack of trust. They've lost our trust in a major way. And not just the horrific racists, and I'm going to read you a couple tweets in a second, not just
Yeah.
the horrific racists that are vegans, but the all of the vegans who stand by and let them, these horrible racists, be their representatives to indigenous communities, and never once stand up to these racists and say, hey, you don't represent me. I'm going to read you something from a fairly famous racist vegan. And I'm not going to name names because we've never had it verified, but apparently this guy was a former leadership in the Vanguard organization
Oh
and is
God.
now the leader of one of the splinter groups, like not Patriot Front, but Patriot Front also splintered off at the same time. So this person was part of that splintering of Vanguard into these other
Yeah.
white nationalist groups. And he called himself Ethnologic until he got himself kicked off of Twitter. And his @ was Etho Logos.
Okay.
So one of the things that he tweeted, and this is something he tweeted on April 28th of 2018, was killing an animal with a bow of any kind is demonstrably less humane and more violent than captive bolt methods standardized by Temple Grandin in the agriculture industry. So this is like literally defending meat
Yeah.
agriculture. Further, the deer population is exploded because of hunting, either due to killing strong bucks or predators. Well, so one, this is the assumption that because the settler killers that they are familiar with, hunters, kill bucks, they want bucks. So they assume that indigenous communities do the same thing, completely disregarding the fact that a lot of our communities have laws about when and what animals we can take. We don't just get to go take strong bucks because we want their
Yeah.
antlers. And you don't see their antlers on our walls at our homes either, usually, because those antlers have good uses and we put them to good uses. We don't just hang them on our walls.
I mean,
So
you might walk into my home and there might be an antler on my altar, but
right, but it's not mounted taxidermied on your
no.
wall, and so
And
that's uses, and hanging on your wall, it becomes pretty useless. So
that,
that's the first thing, is this idea that like what they're used to is what we do, which is not true at all. But let me
it's
tell you a
all about.
precursor to this tweet. So 10 days before he tweeted that, on April 18th of 2018, he tweeted, "Vegans are here to slaughter your archaic traditions. If you're lucky, we may even consider doing it humanely. The old ways must die, and we are the sword that swings, the harbingers of your ideological destruction. Your cultural demise can be swift or slow. That choice is yours." So that's a
Oh my God.
very, yeah, that's a very genocidal threat to indigenous people.
Oh my god. What the
And
actual hell?
the underlying premise of all of this is that our ways are crueler to animals, that being kept by Cargill and JBS and Tyson's in cramped little cages for their entire lives with no chance of escape, no
Yeah.
possibility that they won't die to be eaten as meat, is somehow better than living their entire life free
Mm-hmm.
with no human beings telling them when they can eat, when they can sleep, when they can play, when they can reproduce. No intervention from humans. Not to say that they never see human beings and never
Yeah.
interact with human culture,
Because
but
they
they're
see
not
humans
controlled by it. They are
everywhere.
free. And they literally compare that to worse than what they call slavery. Because they
They
love to call
yeah.
factory farming slavery.
Or they
And
love
yet,
comparing it to the Holocaust.
yeah, or to
You know,
the Holocaust. And yet wildlife is worse off to them in their mind. That's literally what this guy said. That like being free your whole life with a tiny, like a less than 0.0000098% chance that you will be killed by an indigenous hunter. Like it's preferable to know you're going to die after living in a cramped cage your entire life with no freedom ever than to be
and then
free. Like that's insane. But that insanity, that level of delusion is the hinge that all this stuff is built around.
yeah. And then it's like even when they do, acknowledge that, they will go on to try, I don't know, it's like they try to manipulate it to like they try to make a comparison between us and that, when it's like in reality, I can only speak for my ancestors, but to me, that like I'm gonna have to preface this by saying, to me, there's no difference between a fish in the water and a deer on the land. They're both creatures, of when we hunt them or when we fish. My tribe, we specifically, we're from the coast, so we fish. We use all of the fish.
Yeah.
There's sustainability there. We take the bones, we use their scales. There's different ways you could dry out the scales to use it for regalia. There's sustainability there, and it's the key component that I think a lot of, not only are the meat industry and just what these vegans be complaining about are missing, but the vegans themselves are missing. They're missing a big point, which
Oh, more than one. I totally agree with you. They're missing more than one really big
they're
point.
missing. They're missing a couple points.
And they're kind of important points. So I
Very.
should probably give just like a little background about myself for the listeners. And that'll be a good segue into another one of those points. So I grew up in a city and just visiting the res on occasion for holidays
Yeah.
and family get-togethers and things. But I grew up with a hybrid indigenous settler diet, so it wasn't possible for us to eat like a completely
Oh,
indigenous diet.
100. Like, yeah,
But
100%.
meat was definitely not an everyday entree for us. And both of my
Mm-mm.
parents left for work in suits every day, but we still grew all of our produce in our backyard. And we had a pit
Yeah.
smoker and a shed. Like we belonged to a co-op. I think my parents thought that grocery stores were a scam or something. But like we didn't like go to the A&P like all the other families in our area.
Yeah.
And I'm
No.
sure people thought it was very strange that we grew our own food because
Oh, yeah.
there were a few, actually, we were lucky. There were a few other indigenous
People are
people in
very
our
judgmental.
community, but like we would hear from them that people would be like, do you know they grow their food? Isn't that weird? And like the indigenous people in our community would come and tell us, oh, guess what? People think that's weird, and stuff. So, that's kind of how we found out about it. But my personal work and my passion primarily centers around indigenous medicine plants, but it does sometimes cross over into indigenous foodways. And while corporate and academic agriculture, they just don't really care about the soil healing and building properties of growing certain medicine crops, much less like the medicinal properties and the superfood qualities of these plants. But other sectors of agriculture that are more focused on nourishment and sustainability, they do see the values of these plants and the agricultural processes that go into growing them sustainably. And because of that, I've been lucky enough to get to know organizations like the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, who, full disclosure, awarded a resist.org that they grant that they administer to me. So like I'm talking them up. I should probably say that I do have a reason to like them beyond all the good work that they do, but they do amazing work. And I've been lucky enough because of them to get to know a few of the farmers in their amazing network and to hear firsthand how the damage we see on social media manifests as real world harm in the form of stereotype-informed biases about the so-called supremacy of whiteness and the inherent belief in white farming superiority that goes along with it, and leads to unfair practices for not just Indigenous farmers, but all farmers of color, especially in terms of land price, land availability, and financing. And those are the same biases that inform white veganism. And we see this on Twitter all the time. But in my work, I see who's doing the work to revive traditional food sovereignty and build sustainability into core farming practices, and not just in Indigenous communities, but beyond. And I've been blessed to work with people whose passion is rebuilding this country's soil and staving off the impending soil death that future generations are going to die from, you know? And also I should add that I'm old, but a lot of people think I sound like a kid, especially when I'm talking about something I love, like plants and animals. But I was born in the 1960s and I'm a grandmother. So when I talk about olden times, I'm talking from personal experience, including the dawn of the modern vegan movement. I was there for that. Like, I remember that. I went to the commune in Tennessee, the farm. I walked the steeps of the farm. Like, I know from ground up this movement. So I'm not just talking out of my ass from stuff I've seen on social media.
This lived experience.
Yeah, it's lived experience. And then also I've lived in rural farming communities for much of the last decade, and I still do, including one of the oldest Black farming communities in America in the so-called Black Belt, where some of my family still lives today. Even though it's a community where people have to leave to find work elsewhere. But I've seen how Big Ag controls even decades old and well-established settler family farms with practices that go against the knowledge those farmers have acquired. I've seen that soy growing in too many fields soaked in toxic chemicals that require workers to wear hazmat suits, where no thought is being given to the growing soil death issues at all, despite the knowledge of the farmers who own the land.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and like, you know, do these vegans, do they care about that? Do they care about the Indigenous people who, you know, who are being, it's like, I 100%, because, you know, we were talking about it just a moment ago about, you know, the way animals are treated by these colonial structures that are in place, you know, specifically like the meat industry and the dairy industry.
Yeah.
I lost my train of thought. Oh, God. I was on a roll. I was listening to what you were saying. I was getting into it.
Yeah,
but,
no,
you know,
but I mean, I think I could see where you're going and maybe help get you back there just by saying that they don't follow through. Their thoughts end at procurement. They end at purchasing. There is no thought for what happens to these animals once they're liberated. Where do they live? What safe water can they access? What safe soil can they eat the food that's growing from? How do we stave off the pollution that's killing our wildlife? You know, because if we free all those agricultural enslaved animals,
what's going to happen to the land?
Where do they go? Where do they live?
I mean, if, you know, a lot of these white vegans talk about the fact that, you know, specifically with cows, they make up for like, what is it, less 1% of the pollution, greenhouse gases that are emitted into the air every year. It's like, okay, but that's on a smaller scale level because we are, you know, as much as I hate it, they are being killed every day. You know, enough of them are being, you know, there's enough being killed every day versus if you were to let them into a field, into, you know, a few hundred acres of land. I forget what. Gosh, if I remember, I will put it in the description box in the episode. But, you know, it was talking about, you know, the damage within, I think, 5 years it would do to just the, you know, the environment and the habitat, the natural habitat in the surrounding areas. The damage would be awful. It'd be awful. There would be no more vegetation in that area because cows are little veggies. They like their little grass. They like their leaves. You know, they would, and that's not their fault. I think that's what a lot of, like, I wasn't like, when I made that post asking my fellow Indigenous people about this episode, a lot of the white people who were in the comments, specifically, most of them were saying like, why are you always thinking about white people? Well, it's because you guys are always up in my space. You guys never, one, just address that. But another thing I kept seeing throughout the comments, it kept talking about, let me see, hold on. Let me see if I could pull it up, because, I want my receipts. Man, where is my post? I try to keep talking because I get comments all the time. Comments all the time saying,
well, let me just share my sort of definition of these
well,
terms while you're looking.
Yeah, well, see, this is another thing that I had posted. This was also in those comments. This is what this person has said. Her name is Dahlia Garden, which, okay, something tells me that's not really your name, and this is probably a stock photo of a random white woman. So, feel bad for that lady, but they said, why the fuck do you care about white people so much? I mean, I'm flattered you think about us all the time, but rest assured, sweetie, we never think about you. And as far as vegans who are white, why do you listen to them if they're so harmful to you?
Well,
wow.
It's us ignoring them does not legislature from moving against us. It doesn't stop laws from being passed that harm our trap lines and our salmon fisheries and our traditional farmlands. Like, those laws get passed whether we ignore white vegans or not. So the way that we stop those laws from getting passed is by paying attention to those liars and the lying lies they tell so that we can debunk them. So, I mean, that's a pretty simple question to answer. I'm so sorry that Dahlia's garden isn't fertile enough to come to that conclusion on her own.
Well, I'm not gonna accept her apology on her behalf, because you know what, she's gonna have to do that on her own. Oh, lady, that girl.
But I think for a lot of Indigenous people, it comes down to what we're able to see from the outside that is not showing up to the people inside that bubble. Because when I talk about white veganism, I'm not talking about the act of modifying your diet and lifestyle to minimize harm. I'm talking about the idealization of veganism as a political platform that centers Eurocentric biases. And that is how veganism is still performed by a great deal of vegans today. So when I say white veganism is the delusional belief that the harms of consumerism to the natural world can somehow be cured by more consumerism, it comes from a place of personal experience. And when I forget the modifier and just say veganism is the delusional belief that the harms of consumerism can somehow be cured by more consumerism, it's because most mainstream vegans who supposedly don't share those bigoted biases, they've never even considered standing up to any of the white supremacists who they now allow to represent them to all Indigenous communities without complaint. Like, when I see them start to stand up and complain at the white supremacists, not at Indigenous people, but at the white supremacists that they have formally allowed to represent them, then I'll say there's a difference. But I'm not seeing that difference because they're not showing me that difference. They're just denying, reality, and that's not really changing very much.
Also, one of the things, I specifically on
Uh-oh, I've lost you again.
They weren't quite keen on. Hello?
Hello, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
I disconnected for a second. My Wi-Fi is just like going off and on. There's so many people around, so I'm sitting in the car, literally just recording this. So, but what I was saying was, I think, especially amongst younger groups of people, I think, because I'm 20 years old, so I am on the younger side. I was born in 2003. I know there's people around either my age gap or a little bit younger, maybe like middle school age. They seem to misunderstand what Indigenous people and what I mean by white veganism. I think what they think I'm talking about when I say white veganism is white people who are vegans, which, I mean, to a certain degree, yes, because the term white people, a white person isn't necessarily an Irish person or a German person or, a so-and-so person. It's a person that's in, a position of social and political, power in, whatever system they are a part of. That's person is.
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that
Sure,
it's
maybe at the basis. Oh, sure.
You dropped out for a second. Yeah, I can hear you again.
It's like you drop out for a second too, but it's only lightly for a second, and then I just completely just like it just stops. So I just got closer to my Wi-Fi. Well, I moved closer in the car to the opposite side, so I'm closer to the box. So. But like what I was saying, understanding of what white veganism is, and we've been veganism throughout this whole episode. Really, quite a dumbed down explanation of what white veganism is. So I did want to read this definition of what it is according to the queerbrownvegan.com, which, okay, that's a real cute name. I'm gonna give it to them. But according to them, white veganism is a form of veganism that focuses solely on animal liberation while actively ignoring the effects of colonization and how it is interconnected to the oppression of black. And I just think that's honestly like if you were to explain this to anybody, that's a spot on definition that I think, I will be linking everything that I used today that was able to inform me at least a little bit will be linked down below. Also, everything that, Mickey sent me, that will also be everything's linked there, everything. So if anybody's curious as to things from, it will all, so just head down there.
Yeah.
More information that we did not, maybe get deeper into because. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to add that there's actual research being done into whether or not veganism can be separated from the idealism of whiteness. So, or the idealization of whiteness and racism. So Jennifer Polish published in Critical Perspectives on Veganism. If I haven't sent you the link, I will, so you can add it. And on decolonizing veganism. And she explores whether or not it's even possible at this point to separate any form of veganism as it's being practiced from racism. And looking at the perspective of if you're not changing your food ways, how are you really truly mitigating harm? And it really goes into exploring, among other things, that vegans contribute to the same companies that are killing the animals that they gave up meat to avoid contributing to. So
yeah,
I'm not saying that it's the fault of vegans that so many companies are being bought up by meat producers and that so many meat producers have long since launched vegan food, vegan meats, fake meats. That's not necessarily the fault of vegans, but it is the fault of the way vegans approach this because they approach it through consumerism, and the harms to wildlife of consumerism are much, much, much worse than animal agriculture. So when we're talking about shipping food all over especially when they talk about people up north, people who are living in the tundra there, and they're like, well, we'll just ship them vegan food. I've, over the years, when I needed money, I have taken in and cleaned kills for hunters. So I have cut into quite a lot of wildlife in my time. I don't do a lot of hunting myself. I haven't since I was a pretty young person, but I do occasionally do prep meat and skins and things. And I started paying attention to the respiratory tracts of animals about a decade ago. And I've seen, what I don't see is cow methane in their lungs. What I see is soot from petrochemicals. I see soot from shipping products. I see microparticulate, the number one contributor to premature death in human beings is the microparticulate pollution and petrochemicals. We breathe filtered air when we drive in our cars, when we're at work, when we're at home. Our air is filtered through our HVAC systems, through our air conditioning, through our heating systems. Our air is filtered. Wildlife never gets filtered air. Not a lot of studies have been done on how much what's the number one contributor to our premature death is doing to the animals who don't have filtered air. But I can tell you from looking at those bodies, it's much, much worse. So I was able to see the accumulation of that microparticulate pollution grow in the deer that I was cleaning over the last decade tremendously. And most of that microparticulate pollution isn't produced by commutes. People, like, corporations want people to think everything's their personal fault. So they blame commutes for everything, but it's shipping. It's especially ships that ship foods from around the world to the US and sit in the port, off the port of LA, off the coast of Long Beach for days at a time, running their engines so that the refrigeration units can stay cold. All that pollution migrates on shore. All the pollution from all the trucks going to all the grocery stores migrates into the woods, and it gets to the wildlife and it's killing them. And I can't get a single vegan who is not a person of color to pretend to care about this. And I have been trying for over a decade.
I don't think, you know, I'm gonna be 100% honest, and maybe this just says, you know, little cynical Huna Smock at the end trying to beat down a bit, you know. A little bit of hope lost. I don't know if we're ever gonna be able to get through that specific type of person, you know. Especially if they're gonna contend, which I don't know if they know this, but especially something that I've noticed amongst white vegans is, you know, and it's capitalism from the meat industry over to the plant industry, if you know, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah.
And it's like they shame Black and Indigenous people who can't, you know, who can't afford to live that way, because let's be 100% honest, it's a vegan diet, especially if you're living in the inner city where I'm living, it's just not accessible. And also, you know, like you were speaking on earlier, you had the fortune to be able to, you know, grow up your own food, living off, you know, the land with all that. And it's like, where I live, I could not do that. I couldn't grow a garden in the backyard because of the pollution, how bad it gets here in the valley. You know, it's it's all about accessibility.
It was very different in the 60s and 70s, but it's more than that. It's beyond the pollution. Since the 60s and 70s, lots of zoning laws have passed that make it harder and harder for people of color to grow their own food. So it's not just the pollution. It's also that there have been legislation has been passed to make it difficult for people of color to grow their own food, so that we are dependent on corporate foodways.
It's everything. It's everything. It's like everything's built up against us. So even if we wanted to have a diet and live, you know, all that way, or
right, because vegan, the hypocrisy is baked into all of it, you know, and you see that on social media with the way that these same accounts who attack Indigenous people never, and I check receipts, they never, ever tweeted at Tyson's, at JBS, at Cargill, at the big meat killers. We're talking about companies that slaughter billions of people and have a presence on Twitter, and they've never engaged with them at all. But they spend hours, weeks, months of their time attacking Indigenous people for killing like a 0.17 digit, 16 of them zeros, % of the animals killed in the US. It's like such a small fraction that you couldn't tweet it. There's too many characters behind the zero to fit in a tweet. So and that fraction, that's what they're attacking, while they ignore companies that kill billions upon billions of animals every single year.
Well, yeah, while actively ignoring all the other shit that's happening, they'll focus solely on what Indigenous people are doing and how, you know, we are living off the land, and the way, you know, it's
yeah, it's frustrating. It's you sent me an article by Aaron White for Afropunk, And she has a quote in it: "What's so frustrating about too many animal-free platforms is the bizarre prioritization of animal welfare over that of humans who produce the food." But like, back to hypocrisy, like even that is incredibly generous of Aaron White to say, because it doesn't actually prioritize animal welfare at all. Veganism just pretends to. Like we said earlier, there's no plan for those liberated animals after liberation, or concern for how consumerism of any kind, vegan or not, impacts wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
And like it becomes so obvious how much hypocrisy there is in it, and how willing they are to internalize that hypocrisy as their personal truth, when you look at how much of the vegan industry is controlled by Tyson's, Smithfield, Purdue, Hormel, Cargill, and JBS, because they've cornered that market. Like the same people who make Oscar Mayer hot dogs also make Boca burgers.
Those same plant-based burgers,
yeah.
the alternatives to, you know, healthy eating and, you know, environmental action.
Yeah, but when you buy a Boca burger, you're contributing to the same company that makes Oscar Mayer hot dogs and bologna.
And it's also like, how are they being made? How is the food being made that, you know, they're still being factory processed, there's still pollution, and, you know, there's not great shit that's happening behind the scenes of your plant-based burger, you know, versus just eating the burger.
Exactly. JBS is the world's biggest meat company. Last year, they bought a lab-grown meat company called Biotech Foods and a Dutch plant-based meat company called Vivera. And Vivera has a very hysterical corporate tagline when you consider that they're now owned by JBS, the world's largest meat company. Their corporate tagline is, "Life is better when you eat less meat." I mean, the hypocrisy is baked into the system. Veganism is not helping anyone. It's just letting people pretend that if they reach for a different product at probably the exact same store, they've somehow changed how much harm they're doing, and they haven't. There's no change in the amount of harm they're doing. No harm mitigation is happening because you reach for a different box on a shelf when you're at the store. And that's what white veganism is. It's the belief that you can buy your way out of guilt for the harm your consumer lifestyle causes.
I agree 100%. Unfortunately, we are going to have to cut this episode short. My mama is waving me to start getting ready. So I am going to say this, you know, please go follow Mickey on all her social medias. Would you like to, you know, tell them where they could find you at?
Sure. You can find me at EaglesElatis. Eagles like the bird, plural, and Elatis, ELATIS on Twitter.
Yeah, when I was going to have you on the podcast, I had to look up how to say Elatis. That was not a word that was in my vocabulary.
It's a very rare language of the Chalagi people. I'm one of not that many speakers left. So I try to keep it alive in my own little way.
I feel you. You know, my tribe specifically, I'm Tamien. I am Mutsun as well as a bunch of other tribes that were in the regional area with my ancestors. Our languages completely got wiped out, and technically speaking, as of this moment, Tamien is extinct. But thanks to, you know, the lovely researchers, I believe at the San Francisco, can't remember which university it is, but some university in San Francisco. And my Thea Q, Karina Luna Gary, she is the chairperson of the Thamian Nation. They brought back Mutsun, and now we have a dictionary, and it's something that, you know, we are all actively, you know, learning slowly. Me, less so than maybe my cousins, but I still try. So I understand that. I get it.
Well, that's a beautiful thing. Reviving language is incredibly important, and not just because it's important to our cultures, but because it contains so much important environmental knowledge. Like your language contains secrets about your region that no one else knows.
And not only that, it's a great language. I've been, you know, there's been a few times on Twitter where I've just gotten so irritated with colonizers and bigots arguing with me. I'll just straight up reply. I'll straight up reply in Mutsun, and it's just like, you can't argue with me and be a part of the conversation because you can't understand what I'm saying to you.
Yeah.
I honestly, I'm all here for it. Well, thank you so much, Mickey, for coming on my podcast. I'm sure the listeners, they've been wanting a guest. I've been telling them since like episode 4, I'm gonna have somebody on, just working out dates. We're all very busy Indigenous people who you got to do what we got to do.
Well, I am very honored to be your first guest. I hope I didn't
Yes.
disappoint.
No, definitely not. You blew out the. You had me silently in a few parts, and had to make me catch my train of thought, because you did great. You did great. Thank you so much.
Well, I really appreciate it. I'm so glad that you're doing this series. I think it's really important.
I hope to have hopefully the next episode about white veganism, I would hope to have a Black Native or Afro-Indigenous person on to talk about their experience with white veganism, as I do think it is much different than our experiences. I am a white presenting Indigenous person, so I am very open about the fact that I'm not gonna know everything. I'm not gonna. There's just experiences that I haven't experienced that need to be they need to have their limelight. So that's something I'm looking forward to hopefully doing in the future.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
I hope
go
that
ahead.
you do. I think that you're doing a great job here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I'm gonna get going. Normally I would say, I'm the host who the smuck at the end. You go ahead and say your name, and then I'll say the outro. I know this is kind of a little. This is the first time I'm having somebody on, so this is just how we're gonna have to do it.
Okay.
With that being said, I'm your host, Huna Smuck at the end.
And I'm Mickey Barrett.
And this has been the Curious Native Podcast. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.